newsagents.
It's no wonder crooked Joe Biden and the far-left lunatics are desperate to stop us by any means necessary. They are willing to violate the U.S. Constitution at levels never seen before in order to win this election. Joe Biden is a threat to democracy. It's a threat.
Yeah, well, let's not explore the Joe Biden threat to democracy so much coming from a man who seemed to be responsible for an insurrection on January the 6th. But why he is saying what he is saying is that in Colorado, the Supreme Court has ruled that Donald Trump is an insurrectionist and should not be allowed to be on the ballot for the presidential election, in essence. And that has caused an absolute firestorm. Are the courts trying to get Donald Trump from running for election?
There is a stay of execution until the 4th of January. That's when we know if Trump will remain on the ballot or be taken off. So today we're going to explore what the legal ramifications of this are before it goes to the Supreme Court, what the political ramifications might be, and we're also going to take you from Colorado to Wellingborough and one Peter Bone. Don't say we don't take you for a great ride. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
You had
Sounded
to
a bit
think about
uncertain.
that. You had to
I wasn't sure who I was.
It really is the end of the year, isn't
I
it?
was looking at Lewis and was about to say
I
it's
Lewis?
Lewis, but that just would have been too much, I think, for a
And
Wednesday.
weird.
A little bit.
Yeah.
We've morphed into one
Oh, no.
terrible being, legs, body, head of a
Oh,
What a
that's
terrifying
beast.
prospect.
There are
Yeah.
people who aren't going to sleep tonight as a result of you having said that. They're just going to think of
I'm
this.
going to be one of them because I never do.
Yeah.
Call me if you're up.
And these things might not necessarily be unrelated, confusing our identities.
It's true.
So anyway, the news coming out of Colorado last night was pretty jaw-dropping. That people have been talking about this thing, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which could be used. It was designed at the time of the Civil War to stop the secessionists from the South just taking up the jobs that they used to have before the Civil War and to stop them going back into government.
Quite sensible, really.
Yeah, well, there's an argument for it. This is the 14th Amendment, and in Colorado, they have used that theoretical power and turned it into a real power and said that Donald Trump should not be on the ballot for president because he was an insurrectionist on January the 6th.
And what is fascinating about this ruling by the Colorado Supreme Court is that it overturns an earlier ruling by a lower district court. And this came in November. And I remember watching this very closely and thinking, oh, OK, that's the end of that then. The idea that Donald Trump could be part of an insurrection was something that the district court had agreed. But what they said was it couldn't be applied to the office of president. And so in the end, the ruling was basically thrown out. They said we can't take him off the ballot because it can't apply to the office of president. Now, I don't understand where they got that from, because the actual Section 3, 14th Amendment says, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president or vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress, blah, 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 shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion or given aid or comfort to the enemies. So let's just go through those things then. He definitely took an oath of office to be president. We know that.
We witnessed all of that.
We witnessed that. Did he engage in insurrection or rebellion? That seems to me critical, and it, at the moment, is left in the balance because there is no conviction. But that wasn't the point that the lower court was making. The lower court said, yes, he has. And the Supreme Court have just confirmed that and says, yes, he did. Remember, it's not just engaging in insurrection, it's giving aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. And I guess if we go back to January the 6th, because that's essentially what they're talking about, was there something in his messaging? Was there something in the messaging he sent out in the previous weeks and months trying to overturn that election that Joe Biden won that would fit under this description of somebody trying to overthrow democracy? And I guess it's quite hard to argue that he wasn't a part of that.
But it seems that the legal argument has basically centered around the fact that you just read out the wording, Emily, and although it specifies no person shall be a senator, representative, elector of president or vice president, i.e. one of the literal electors of the Electoral College, because it doesn't specify presidents as a title, the district court decided that it didn't apply. The Supreme Court has said, well, that's kind of ridiculous because it says any officer of the United States, so that must include president. I think, frankly, probably the explanation of this is that back in the 1860s, when this was drafted and passed, it seemed inconceivable that the president might ever, who was, of course, Lincoln and then his successors, might have ever engaged in
They'd be
insurrection.
like,
They were the ones
you're asking what?
Yeah, exactly. Lincoln. It's like they're the ones trying to stop the secessionists and the insurrectionists. But it is worth bearing in mind that this is since Reconstruction, i.e., since the remerging of the United States in the Confederacy after the end of the Civil War. This has been such a dusty passage of legal text. I mean, it has only been invoked twice. Once in the 1920s, and then once against one of the literal insurrectionists from January the 6th. So this is really rare. And it's also worth saying that in Colorado itself, this was a 4-3 split judgment, even within the Supreme Court. So this is
Completely
this is
democratically
all new
appointed
law.
Supreme
This is
Court.
new law. This is not had to be. I was reading like several legal scholars last night saying this is just stuff that jurists, American justices, have not had to think about or apply since Civil War, i.e. basically in living memory.
But this is politically explosive. I mean, before we get into a dusty legal argument, the idea that the courts are going to rule that Donald Trump cannot run for the next presidential election is epic. I think the justices in Colorado were very mindful of that when they said, we do not reach these conclusions lightly. We are mindful of the magnitude and weight of the questions now before us. We are likewise mindful of our solemn duty to apply the law without fear or favour and without being swayed by public reaction to the decisions that the law mandates we reach. So you've got a lot of Democrats very excited by this judgment, and you have got the Donald Trump campaign weaponizing it instantly as a means of raising money. And of course, Republican opponents to Donald Trump, who've been out on the stump doing their speeches around the country, have reacted to what happened in Colorado. This is Donald Trump's fiercest opponent, Chris Christie.
Well, this came out about, let's say we've been here about 20 minutes, so half an hour ago. It's a 213-page opinion. It came out while I was in the car. I started to try to read it. Didn't get very far. But let me just say, so I can't comment on the opinion itself because I want to read it first. But what I will say is this. I do not believe Donald Trump should be prevented from being president of the United States by any court. I think he should be prevented from being president of the United States by the voters of this country. That's what I think. And I don't believe that it's good for our country if he's precluded from the ballot by a court. I think it's bad for the country if that happens.
I mean, those are the most inevitable responses because they still can't allow for the fact that they are trying to fight Donald Trump. I mean, privately, they're probably whoops of joy, but publicly, they are still taking on the courts in the same language, pretty much, that Donald Trump is. Vivek Ramaswamy, who you're going to hear next, went one step further and just injected a little bit of craziness into his own response.
They have just tried to bar President Trump from the Colorado ballot using an unconstitutional maneuver that is a bastardization of the 14th Amendment to our U.S. Constitution. This is a hollowed-out husk of what the country was built on. The basic principle that we, the people, select our leadership, not the unelected elite class in the back of palace halls. That's old world Europe, not the United States. That's why I'm making a pledge today that I will withdraw, I pledge to withdraw from the Colorado GOP primary ballot unless and until Trump's name is restored. And I demand that Ron DeSantis and Chris Christie and Nikki Haley do the same thing, or else these Republicans are simply complicit in this unconstitutional attack on the way we conduct our constitutional republic.
I think the worry that the Democrats have now, and the staffers are sort of messaging their own sort of people in this, is that it's going to be rocket fuel. It's going to be how he gets his campaign going. And they're waiting now. We're all waiting to see what the Supreme Court, the actual Supreme Court, does, whether it overturns the Colorado Supreme Court ruling, and if it does, how it does so, and whether Trump actually uses this whole sort of interim 4 weeks before Iowa to claim victimhood, to claim he's Nelson Mandela again.
And I think when it goes to the Supreme Court, and obviously we should remember that obviously this is a court where Trump himself has appointed 3 of the justices. It has a 6-3 conservative supermajority. I think most people would expect them to knock the Colorado judgment back. And if they do, then it basically means that these other challenges that have been being made by anti-Trump forces in different states to get him off the ballot in different states will be done, because the Supreme Court will have judged that the 14th Amendment does not apply to Trump. And it is just worth saying, or just noting, what the other 3 justices who opposed this on the Colorado Supreme Court were saying, because they all basically agreed, actually, that he was an insurrectionist. They agreed that you could argue that the 14th Amendment might apply. But what they were basically saying, including the Colorado Chief Justice, was saying that because he had not been tried in a court anywhere, because at the moment he's not guilty officially of being an insurrectionist, it wasn't possible for the court, or shouldn't be possible for the court, to say he shouldn't be allowed to run under the 14th Amendment, because then you would get potentially that being abused in future, of other people saying, well, they're an insurrectionist, or they've broken the law, and so on.
Okay, I'm going to make a prediction and stick my neck out, which you can then hold me to early next year when we get the Supreme Court judgment. My prediction is that the Supreme Court will vote 9-0 against the Colorado ruling. I think it will be unanimous that the Supreme Court will stick to the long-held political doctrine of people who are running for election. It is for the voters to decide whether they run or not the courts. And they will hold that if Donald Trump is accused of being an insurrectionist, if Donald Trump is accused of having flouted the Constitution, it is for the voters to cast their judgment, not for the courts to decide who should be on the ballot and who shouldn't be. And I just don't think that the 6-3 kind of conservative majority against liberals is even relevant in this case. I just can't see any of them wanting to do that. There is a political argument as well to all of this, which is, and I think, Emily, you alluded to it, it's that, look, if you think that Donald Trump is a frigging menace and a danger to democracy and a threat to the Western Alliance and undermines democracy, what you're doing is giving him victimhood, which is also what is turbocharging his campaign right now. And that by going along and getting all excited, Democrats getting all excited about, we can beat Donald Trump via the courts, we don't need to do it in an election, absolutely plays into the sense of victimhood, plays into the sense of the deep state, plays into the sense that people are ganging up against him because they're scared of him.
I'm going to take you on and your prediction, because I think you cannot merge the legal and the political when it comes to the Supreme Court. And I know that we've talked about the fact that he's appointed these justices, and I know there is a sense now that they will be weighted in favour of Donald Trump. But actually, either you believe in the American Constitution or you don't. And if you believe that the Supreme Court is acting within the law, the US Constitution, then why doesn't this become a seminal part? The 14th Amendment, aside from this question of insurrection, also is about granting citizenship to all persons born in the US. So if Arnold Schwarzenegger came along and said, I would like to be on the ballot for president, he would be struck down constitutionally because he was born outside America. And so actually...
But that is clear and express.
But I think you get into very murky waters when you're saying, oh, the Supreme Court will do that, won't they? Because either you have to be working within the literal rule book, the Constitution is the literal rule book of the USA, or else you don't. And I think it doesn't bode well for us, right? If we are using the same, if you like, inverted Trump handbook, which is, oh, well, they're all going to be, this is a witch hunt, they're all going to be against us, oh, it's a political fight. Can I just bring in one thing? We prayed you, Vivek Ramaswamy, who's the other candidate, the slightly off-the-charts candidate, a little bit earlier, saying he pledged to withdraw from the Colorado GOP primary ballot until Trump was also allowed to be on the ballot. The Colorado Republican Party have now responded to that. to Vivek's own little video saying, you won't have to, because we will withdraw from the primary as a party and convert to a pure caucus system if this is allowed to stand. Now, I defer to the primary caucus explainer in my learned friend over there. But essentially, this has got deeply political, and the Colorado Republican Party is already turning it into something political. And maybe I'm naive, but I just think you have to believe that the rule of law still stands.
I can disagree with both of you, right? So if we're going on the full three-way round, right? So, John, I think you're wrong in the sense that if you've broken a law and if you are an insurrectionist, then I think this provision of the Constitution is a very good one. There should be a sanction for someone not just breaking the law, but committing that cardinal violation of American democracy or any democracy, which is to deny election results and basically try and orchestrate an overthrow of the democratic institution.
If that's not what the law is for, what is it for?
And I think that clause is a very, very sensible idea, because what it does is say that you cannot act with impunity. That said, I also think that the problem basically is that because this provision has been so rarely litigated, there is no precedent. It is murky because it is not necessarily clear right now. You can still argue about whether indeed he has committed the insurrection. You can argue, because he has not gone through the legal process yet, as to whether it should be the judges just declaring that and saying it, or whether it should go through the legal process, which of course it is going through that process in a separate case. And I think this is the other point, right, which is that, let's not forget, this is not the only date with destiny that Trump is going to have with the Supreme Court. If they take up this case, there's going to be this. Then they're also supposed to be deciding whether or not he's immune from criminal prosecution for actions
and that's
he took
the January
in office.
The 6th charges.
The January the 6th charges. And the scope of an obstruction charge that is also central to the federal case on January the 6th. So he has not just got this bit of litigation coming the Supreme Court's way. They are deciding his fate in all sorts of other ways over the course of the next few months.
I mean, it's very confusing for the special counsel's case, Jack Smith, who is literally talking about a case that would involve convicting Trump of the January the 6th riots, right? Or of his part in the January the 6th riots. If he's already been assumed to be convicted by this judgment, I don't know what that means legally, criminally.
So, Lewis, I mean, that's the point I was making, that, look, I think that there is a political doctrine that the Supreme Court does not decide who is on a ballot and who is not. And therefore, when you've got a piece of untested law, like Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, they're going to say, you know what? This is untested. We don't know this. It's not the clear-cut statement that you have to be over 35 years old to run for the president and you have to have been born in the USA. That is absolutely clear. That's established. So I just think that the court will say, this is not for us, and all 9 of them will agree on that Trump's name can go forward.
But if, because of the January the 6th case and because of the Georgia case, if Trump were to be convicted for those, I think that then we would be in a different situation. And in that case, what I would say is that the court should not be, I mean, whether it turns out to be the case is a different question, but in that case, the court should not be taking political considerations about, how Trump will respond to it and how his supporters will respond to it in any way. Law is law is law.
I think what we've got to talk about, actually, is the timing of all this, because that is critical. Now, the idea that the Colorado Supreme Court would give any appeal until January the 4th, not an incidental date, because January the 5th is the day that they certify who's actually on their ballots. This is just for the primary, right? We should clarify this is for the Republican primaries. Now, the Supreme Court might decide to act very, very quickly indeed, or it might not. And if they drag it out, or if they don't drag it out but just want to take their time, I don't mean to imply a sort of, an unwillingness, but if they just say we're going to take this very slowly, then just think how much gets through already. His name remains on the ballot until it's taken off. So actually they've gone through January the 5th. If he starts to win in Iowa, which, every likelihood suggests he might do, then what happens after he's already got that victory? If it doesn't even happen before March, when we're seeing him, A, before the special counsel, and B, Super Tuesday, then we're into really murky territory. And it could just be the Supreme Court says, don't rush us.
Or they throw it back to the states.
And he's already on the ballot.
And he's on the ballot in some places, but then he's not in other places.
I mean, time is actually possibly the Democrats' biggest enemy in all this.
I mean, whatever happens with this isn't the kind of sort of true essence of this story in a way. It's a glimmer, just like a little glimmer of the potential constitutional chaos that could unfold and will likely unfold if Trump is the nominee next year. Not just with regards to this, an
But
insurrectionist,
with all the court
but with
cases.
all of the court cases, that he becomes president-elect and then he ends up in jail. It is just, I mean, talk about this being a little bit of untested law. The constitutional and political and judicial stress test that the American system is going to go through next year. We thought that would be the case in 2016, 17. We ain't seen nothing yet if Trump isn't stopped and is on the ballot.
I also think it throws it back onto those around him. And I mean the Republican candidates, because, you know, this was the chance that they had, right? We know that he always plays the referee. He always talks about the witch hunt. He always talks about victimhood and all the rest of it. If they're not going to stand up at this point, I think we can assume they are never going to stand up. They will never speak out.
They are never going to.
Right.
All the time that they think Donald Trump is strong and able to affect their lives, I mean, directly, in terms of whether they run again for office or whether they are kind of set upon by the MAGA crowd, they're never going to stand up.
And this is the party of conservative constitutionalism.
Yeah.
Like, this is the party that is always quoting the US Constitution at you when they talk about gun rights, right?
And but that's the point as well, right? If the Republican Party had its house in order and had done so long ago, none of this would have ever got to the courts. None of it would have ever got to the law. None of these stress tests would ever be happening. It's the Republican Party's institutional failure, which was institutional failure number one, from which all of the other institutional stresses flow.
And if you want one turning point in all of this, one moment, it was after January the 6th, and they had the opportunity to convict Donald Trump,
100%.
the second impeachment
And that would be
trial,
it.
and that would have been curtains. We
But
wouldn't
don't
be
forget-
You're not allowed.
And
I mean,
Mitch
technically,
McConnell
a majority in both houses did. Now, we know for impeachment it has to be 2/3 to actually get through. But if you look at the raw numbers,
It's those 10 senators, basically.
It
Well,
was
no,
those
but if you look
senators-
at the
if
raw
Mitch
numbers,
if Mitch McConnell had put
majority-
his thumb down
Yeah.
for Donald Trump, he carries considerable support in the Senate. If he'd put his thumbs down, they would have gone with him,
You're
and
right.
they would have voted to convict Donald Trump, and he would no longer have a security detail. He would no longer be able to run for public office. It would be history.
yeah.
And there's
That
no
is-
constitutional
Mitch
grey area
McConnell
about
is,
that.
just in pure numbers terms, slightly different point, both houses, the majority of both houses, have already convicted Trump of insurrection. And I think that's a really important fact, that when they hear this, it's not for the first time. It's not a court that's doing this. The politicians have already accepted that.
And if you haven't had enough America, and how can you have enough America?
We're only just beginning.
We're only just beginning a News Agents USA Christmas edition, a question and answer session with you, our wonderful listeners. Some great questions and some really average answers from Mateless and me.
I was going to say, if they've had enough America, I mean, 2024, I mean, they might want to unsubscribe. Not
Or
that
go
I'm
and live in a
encouraging
small-
that.
Yeah, the one thing I hate is US presidential elections. I think I'll take myself off it.
I think if you've had enough, go and live on a small Polynesian island
might
where there
not-
is no connectivity.
We might not be your podcast for 2024.
So among Rishi Sunak's wish list of things that he wanted for Christmas, probably a by-election in Wellingborough in Northamptonshire wasn't high on the list, because Rishi Sunak could do without any by-elections at all next year, given what's happened this year. And yet that is what we are going to get. Dear departed Peter Bone, ex-MP.
And this all follows another Conservative MP who has been found guilty of misconduct by Parliament's independent expert panel, Standards Committee, who was found to have subjected a member of his staff to bullying, sexual misconduct. He denies any wrongdoing. He was then suspended for 6 weeks, voted on by the whole House. That is far above the 10-day threshold, which automatically triggers a recall petition. That recall petition has been ongoing in this Northamptonshire seat of Wellingborough over the last few weeks. We got the results about 8 o'clock last night. 13% of the electors there have voted for it, so he's being recalled.
Yeah, and it's an interesting process, this sort of the recall vote, because you have to hit a 10% threshold, and it requires constituents to actually go to a town hall. You can't just sort of fill in a form or tick a box or, you know, fill in something on your doorstep. You have to make it down to your town hall on a sort of wet, cold Tuesday night and say, we want to have a by-election. 13% of his constituents turned up. Peter Bone is arguing that that leaves 86% of the constituents who actually were quite happy with him going on the way he was. And he may yet choose to stand as an independent in this. But I think what's different for Labour, who are basically the main competitors this time round, is that this is a much harder seat for them to fight than Mid-Beds, even though Mid-Beds had the Lib Dems involvement, and they have to do it in record time. Because it's probably going to be early February the 6th.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the timing of this is really, really interesting. So is it in the gift of the government to decide when they move the writ for the by-election? Theoretically, they could put that off for some time. They may decide they want to get it out of the way. I mean, it is another one of those absolutely true blue Conservative seats. It's got a majority of 19,000. It was Labour briefly in the Blair period, but it is a very, very Brexity seat. Labour already trying to Labour sources sort of talking about, this is going to be really, really hard for us. A good second for us would be a good place. Obviously, this is all expectation management, but I do think genuinely it will be a challenge. And the timing is a really interesting thing in the sense that what do you do if you're Sunak? Does the prospect of more by-elections, because don't forget, there is also probably going to be one in Blackpool with Scott Benton. He is now going through the same process. His constituents are going to have a recall petition. They can decide whether or not they want to recall him. Does that start to play into the timing around
It's our
an
own
election?
sort of primary season, isn't it? It's just like Iowa, but a bit lower grade.
I mean, we were saying about this with Benton the other day. I mean, the recall petition legislation really does change the dynamics quite substantially. I mean, the government's majority has gone down, working majorities from the election have gone down to 80. If they lose both of these, it will be down to around the 50 mark. And that is not an insubstantial proportion of that is as a result of misbehaving MPs, to put it mildly, in some cases, in some occasions, basically losing their seats through recall petitions. But if you think you're going to lose Wellingborough, they will almost certainly lose Blackpool, which I could imagine might be on the same day of the local elections if there's not a general election. It just, again, adds into that sort of drumbeat of failure and of beleagueredness that afflicts governments towards the end of their terms.
And that is why the by-election is important. I mean, marginally in terms of the size of your majority, it goes down. It is the narrative that you're trying to change. That all the Conservative Party apparatchiks will be kind of over Christmas thinking, right, new year, we've got to get our messaging right, we've got to get on the front foot, we've got to relaunch. Look at the inflation numbers, look how successful we're being. And, they got good news again today with the inflation numbers coming down again. So they'll be trying to do all of that. And every time you get a by-election, it knocks you back. It knocks you back. And they are a pain in the backside for a government that is trying to reset the agenda at a time when it is consistently, stubbornly 20 points behind in the polls with no sign of improvement.
I don't think this is a done deal for Labour. It could be a win. And I say that because I think Labour, I mean, you're right, they're playing down expectations, but I think they're still more nervous because they haven't got the time. I was speaking to some of those who were sort of running the campaign. When it came to Mid-Beds, they had a long time to prepare. I mean, they knew what they were doing.
That's why Nadine hold on.
Right. I don't know what was going on there, but they had enough time to get all their data collected. And I've been told this time it's going to be big, brash, positive challenge, right? That's how they're going to go in there because they've only got a month to do it. They're just going to go and sort of singing and shouting. They can't actually knuckle down all the data in time. They know people don't like Peter Bone there, but in a way, they're not really fighting him. They're fighting the Conservative values of, whoever Rishi Sunak wants to put in next. And if they get that wrong, as you said, it's still a, nearly 20,000 majority to overturn.
I do think Wellingborough actually weirdly becomes quite an important moment in the early part
if he
of
wins
politics
it,
next year. Yeah,
if he wins
one way or
it,
the other.
it's a big moment.
So if he wins it, there will be those suddenly clamouring to say, so let's imagine it's in like mid-February, and I think, Emily, you're right, they'll probably try, I would imagine, to do it early so they can exactly prevent Labour's ground game getting up and running and try and just sort of...
And also get it out of the way.
Get it out of the way, exactly. If they get a win... then people say, even though it's a rock-solid seat, they should be winning it. People will be going, nice bit of momentum
things aren't
for
that
Rishi
bad.
Sunak. We're getting up to the local elections. Remember, dissolution, if there's going to be an election in May, they will have to dissolve Parliament by late March. So, it will not be, there won't be much time between Wellingborough and that. If they lose, then you will see internal opponents of Sunak saying, look at this. Look, we've had Mid-Beds, we've had Wellingborough, we've had Selby and Ainsty. We're probably going to have terrible local election results. This is our last chance to get rid of this dead duck, Rishi Sunak. And his internal political position becomes more unstable. So I think Wellingborough will actually prove, weirdly, quite an important moment.
Very
in
compelling
the
for the
politics.
newsagents.
Very compelling for the newsagents.
We will be in Wellingborough. Should we make that promise or not?
We keep making
We
these
did
comments.
promise we'd go to
Yeah,
Mid-Beds
we
and then we didn't. So I don't know if we... I mean,
did. In
we might go to
spirit.
Mid-Beds.
Let's put in brackets, in spirit.
In spirit, we are Wellingborough people, as well as Colorado people as well.
Yeah, very much
In
so.
spirit, yeah.
Not many shows bring you Colorado and Wellingborough at once. Too few in my view.
Well, if we're going to have a deployment, if we're going to have a newsagents,
I know how this is going to end up. I'm going to end up in Wellingborough, and you two
Somebody's
end up
going to be
in
in
Denver.
Aspen.
Yeah, I know. I mean, Vale's lovely skiing. The back bowls of Vale, really
Boulder,
nice.
Colorado.
If
Boulder,
only you
Colorado.
weren't
Oh,
already
my
going
God.
skiing the day after we come back from
stop
our
it,
holiday.
stop
I think
Here
that
we
is
go
our
again.
Colorado send now. Actually, now I think
it is.
about it. Never mind. Oh well.
Before we go, Sasha has been in touch with us. Not Santa, Sasha. Dear the Newsagents team, I hope you are well. Loving the podcast as always, especially the recent Newsagents Investigates episode. Oh, that's you, Lewis Goodall. It was very good. As Christmas gets closer and some of us are looking for last-minute gifts, I was wondering if Emily, John and Lewis could suggest which books on British or international politics from the last year they would recommend reading. Best wishes, Sasha.
Shall we let Sasha into our secret?
We don't read. We can't
Well,
read.
it
We're
was
illiterate.
something that we
We're
discovered last
functionally-
time round.
We're functionally
podcast to
illiterate.
make.
We discovered last time round that every time John talks about Trump's actions being unprecedented,
Oh, come
he unwittingly promotes his own book,
Ooh.
Unprecedented.
I've often thought, if only they didn't speak English.
Yeah, if only they
Have you
didn't
ever
speak
thought about
English.
that? If only
I've wondered
that.
about
Someone
it.
should
I've
write
wondered
about
another day at the
that.
circus.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm such an airhead.
All that.
You know, always.
You know what?
I
And
keep
Blair is
forgetting.
such a moderniser. Someone
Yeah, he
should
is
do a
a
little
moderniser,
biography
yeah.
of that.
So we've
He's
all
still
got all four of my
modernising
books.
now.
Look, come on, Goodall.
It's
I've
got to
a
be
few
from the
books,
last
come on.
year.
Either one. Look, last year. So at the very start of this year, I read a book that was it's basically a history of British political history, 20th century, very a la mode for me, called The Death of Consensus: 100 Years of British Political Nightmares by Phil Tinline. And that was basically all about the idea that you can basically divide British political history or any political history in terms of the kind of parameters of the ideas that are basically allowed at that time. And you have three big consensuses where basically people say, these ideas are allowed, these aren't. They break down over the course of the 20th century, and it's just a really different sort of interesting way of kind of conceptualising British political history over the last 100 years. Brilliant book.
Mine, I think, is going to be the book I read over the summer. And I was hopping round because I was so excited about it. And it was Naomi Klein's book, Doppelganger.
You tweeted it from France.
I
with a little
tweeted it
glass
from
of
France.
Sauterne
I
or
was,
something.
Okay, so I was reading it with Rosé. Might or might not have helped.
Best way of reading
But
these books.
it was an incredible book. And in a way, it's got better the further I've got away from it, because it's about the war on objective truth. And she talks about the mirror imaging in language of the real thing and the opposite thing. And actually, when you now hear Trump, for example, talking about having to impeach Biden, or Trump saying we've got to lock him up, or Trump saying he's the greatest threat to democracy, I now understand it through the prism of taking the same language and almost turning it upside down. You use that sloganeering language, but just turn it round. And it's sort of quite destructive because you lose your sense of where the truth is coming from. And she writes brilliantly about this in America, kind of leading up to Trump and now.
I'm going to go for a book which I'm a bit of the way through, but I find it fascinating. The Identity Trap by Yasha Monk. Yeah. Which is kind of... Yasha Monk is an American-German political scientist, progressive, but worried about the way identity politics is taking over reasonable debate and the danger that it makes the left unelectable and the right dominant because of everything being seen through the prism of identity politics. And I kind of think that that's a really interesting discussion, which underlies so much of the conversations that we've had on this podcast over the past year.
Have you two read that book about the biography of Biden that came out? The Last Politician.
I read Biden's called Promise Me Dad.
Oh, I never read that one. Was that good?
It was quite schmaltzy. I mean,
Well,
sorry, in the
that's
best
him.
possible
Hello,
way.
That's
American
all him.
politics.
Yeah, there's a lot of kind of going
Emoting.
off and sailing with your dad.
That one, The
sort
Last
of thing.
Politician, I read that on honeymoon. That was really, it was all rock and roll.
You read that on honeymoon. Let's just let that sentence sink in.
Yeah, by Franklin Foer. It was really good. It was really good because the thesis of it is basically that Biden, which is kind of obvious, but he really sort of extrapolates it out, is that he is the kind of last of something. That he's the kind of last gasp of the sort of old institutional American political order, and that, like, he sees his presidency very much as the idea of still proving that politics can work, that Congress can work, that the system can work.
Although
And obviously-
last gasp is probably not a phrase he himself will
no,
be
probably
using.
not. I mean, it's funny because it sort of ends, because obviously it's obviously we don't know the ending of that thesis yet, but it sort of ends in kind of late summer or sort of towards the end of 2022 when Biden actually was probably riding quite high, and so it ends on quite a positive, the idea that actually he is proving it, and it kind of probably feels a little bit different now.
Look, they have used, I mean, he has successfully used the fact that he stands for democracy. I mean, the line that he said last night was, if Trump wins, then everything is lost. It's not just 4 years. It's the institutions, it's the judiciary, it's the sense of balance in the system, it's respect for our, international allies and all the rest of it. And I think it's a point that Biden never gets credited for making, why are you talking better about the economy? But he has won on it. In 2020, don't forget, Trump started his argument about winning before the election, and he won on it in 22, and arguably he won on it in part in the elections of 23. I think that is a real strength of Biden's, actually, to keep hammering that home.
I tell you, this is a sort of counterintuitive point about when we're talking about books. I'm going to talk about the unwritten books. How little there has been about the Biden presidency compared to the Trump presidency, because it was such a leaky, crazy place. And there are so many people that are still very, very loyal to Joe Biden that you haven't had the kiss and tell memoirs of
been
people
thrown out.
Yeah, because Joe Biden retains loyalty of an awful lot of his staff, and there just hasn't been that kind of. You've looked at the number of books that my own feeble contribution included, but I mean, you look at the books of some of the great American writers of political history and political science.
Do you remember the story of Michael Wolff?
Who just sat down in the West Wing?
He got a pass and just sat down and sort of stayed for 6 weeks, like a sort of happy
listening
camper.
to all the conversations.
Totally non-topical book. I thought of you a little bit, John. I thought this could well be you. I actually read Roy Jenkins' memoir earlier in the year, Life in the Centre.
Yeah.
And a little bit reminded me of you. I could imagine you in a similar sort of book writing kind of thing. In the preface,
He
said,
walked around his tennis court a lot.
Yeah. Well, he said, by the summer of 1988, I decided the time for getting over such hesitations about writing this book had come. Accordingly, one August morning, staying in a house in Liguria, eating oysters and looking down on the narrow cove of Parigi, I started to write, and 26 months and many writing places later, I got to the end. So you could imagine you doing that, John. Very you. Sitting there with some oysters over a nice little cove in some Italian bay. How long is it going to be before that little vista comes in 2024? Not long.
Roy Jenkins left the comments and he said, I leave without regret or wanker. and one of the Labour MPs, I can't remember who it was his parliamentary aide, who said, why, are you taking him with you?
Tell you what, Colorado, Wellingborough, Roy Jenkins and Wanker, there, you don't get that on every show, do you?
We'll be back tomorrow. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.